Just days after taking a 10% stake in Intel, President Trump is signaling plans to pursue similar investments in other major companies, creating a new model for how government engages with big business. Watch.
I want to try and get as much as I can. In the case of Intel, it was interesting, but I hope I'm going to have many more cases like it. Intel came in. I'd like you to give 10% of Intel to the United States of America. Not to me, to the United States of America. I just made $10 billion or $11 billion for the United States of America. And yeah, there will be other cases. If I have that opportunity again, I would do that.
Joining me now is the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Scott Bessent. Mr. Secretary, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here.
Morning, Maria.
And we wanted to start there because, of course, if you're a free market capitalist, oftentimes you don't want to see government taking stakes in businesses. But I wonder if this is a national security issue more than anything else. Can you walk us through your thinking and the president's thinking in terms of taking a 10% stake in Intel and what could happen next?
Sure, Maria. And look, if we go back to, say, the COVID times, we could see that there was an airline rescue plan, and a lot of that was debt. And I can tell you some of that debt is still outstanding at 1%. So it was a good deal for the American people to keep the airlines flying, but financing private businesses still at 1% was not a good deal. And what President Trump is doing, President Trump is going to be the only president in modern times who creates assets for the American people rather than debt. And we looked, he saw that Intel had been given grants and wanted to know why the American taxpayer wouldn't participate in the upside. So there's $11 billion of immediate value, and I think there's a very good chance here that it could be much more. But as you said, chips are a strategic necessity for us. One of the things we learned during COVID was that the United States has 5 to 7 strategic vulnerabilities in critical industries, and President Trump has said about de-risking that. And while we're de-risking it, there's also substantial upside for the American taxpayer.
Well, it's very hard to argue with free money and the fact that the support for Intel was already there from the CHIPS Act, and the president turning that into equity and the government having a stake and creating this value of $11 billion is pretty incredible. It's hard to argue with that, but are you considering taking stakes in further semiconductor companies? I mean, would the president consider taking a stake in NVIDIA?
Well, Maria, I don't think NVIDIA needs financial support. So, that seems not on the table right now. But could there be other industries where that we're reshaping, something like shipbuilding? That sure. There could be things like that, and these are critical industries that we have to be self-sufficient in the United States. And for 20, 30, 40 years, this was neglected. And as I've said many times, the only good thing about COVID was it was a beta test for if we were to go into a kinetic war or get cut off from some of these industries. Think about it. 80–90% of the precursor pharma products are made overseas, and that's just unacceptable because, as we saw during COVID, the manufacturing countries will keep it for themselves.
Yeah, and I think, it took a businessman in the Oval Office to really see the upside of some of these things. You mentioned shipbuilding. What about defense companies? I mean, this is obviously an area where the U.S. has to win. And is it a serious consideration to take any stakes in some defense companies?
I don't know if we need to take stakes in defense companies. We'll see whether the defense companies are fulfilling their mission in terms of providing adequate and timely deliveries for the U.S. military, as opposed to maybe an overemphasis on the shareholders. What we saw with Boeing, think about what happened to Boeing, which was one of our great American companies. Rather than spending money on R&D and new plane development, they did this massive share buyback. A CEO walked out with $250 million, a failed CEO, and it has crippled one of America's great companies for several years. So, we do have to think about, with all these companies, what is the mission?
So should other shipping companies, should other semiconductor companies be worried about political influence or, Intel getting a better treatment than other companies? All of the issues that any free market capitalist would think about with regard to government owning stakes in companies.
No, I think the other semiconductor companies, they have done well, but again, what we've ended up with is 99% of the advanced chips in the world are manufactured on the island of Taiwan, and that's a national security risk like we haven't seen since the Arab oil embargo. So, we just have to de-risk several aspects of the U.S. economy.
Well, yep, I'm sorry.
And as you said, President Trump's a businessman, and he's very solution-oriented. It's inconceivable to me that administration after administration has just let these strategic risks just sit around.
Yeah.
And there's a group of us in this administration, led by President Trump, who believe that if we leave office in January 2029 and we have not de-risked the U.S. economy, then we have failed, and we are not going to fail.
And you've talked about this since the beginning of the second term, the president's second term, and you've done this in a number of ways, whether it be the golden share in the Nippon U.S. Steel merger or the 15% revenue from NVIDIA and AMD sales to China. Even with Fannie and Freddie, you already have, it's conservatorship, and you're going to be taking some of that public. What are your plans for Fannie and Freddie? Are you expecting to do an IPO of some $30 billion later on this year, sir?
Maria, we're not sure on the timing. There's a lot of work to be done, but again, there's substantial value for the American taxpayer there. We are moving deliberately and forward on this, and we'll see on the timing. We've had meetings with all the big banks, and there are a couple of things there. One, the structure of the U.S. mortgage market. We're committed to making sure that there is no change in the spread mortgage over treasuries. We actually believe there are things that can be done to make mortgages cheaper for the American people. And then on the other side, these are tremendously valuable companies. And President Trump wants to realize some of the value.
Well, this is huge value there. You're talking about $7 to $8 trillion in assets under management between these two companies. We're talking about a $30 billion deal. Do you look at that and say we don't even want to sell more than that because you want to keep some conservatorship? You want to keep some stake there in Fannie and Freddie?
That's what the banks have advised so far. A $30 billion deal would be one of the biggest deals, maybe the biggest deal in history. And these are very large companies, valuations in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So if we were to sell a 3 to 6% stake, it would work out to at least that.
All right, so a 3 to 6% stake, if you sell 5%, that's the kind of numbers you're talking about. Secretary, have you decided, has the president decided on which bank will be the lead bank? I know every bank is clamoring for it.
Well, every bank's going to be, all the big banks are going to be part of something that's this size, and we're honing in on that. The president's been busy doing peace deals, trade deals, tax deals, and he can multitask better than anyone I've ever seen. I have trouble keeping up. So, I imagine sometime in September, early October, we'll be making a decision.
All right, and then maybe you'll have one lead and several others below the lead. Is that the thinking?
one lead, two leads, and then a deal of this size, every firm on the street is going to be involved.
Yeah.
And we want a high-quality group of institutional, international investors, and we're going to carve out some for the American people.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of bankers. They already tell me that this expectation is already oversubscribed, that you've got people wanting in right now, and we don't even have it on the books yet. Let me move on to the tariff, Secretary, because President Trump's 50% tariff on India kicking in today, weeks after adding that 25% penalty over India's purchases of Russian oil and weapons. Meanwhile, India is vowing to retaliate. India's foreign minister says if the U.S. does not like India buying Russian oil, it should not buy from India. Mr. Secretary, your thoughts?
Look, Maria, this is a very complicated relationship. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have very good relationships at that level. And it's not just over the Russian oil. The Indians came in very early after Liberation Day to start negotiating on tariffs, and we still don't have a deal. I thought that we would have a deal in May, June. I thought India could be one of the earlier deals. And they've kind of tapped us along in terms of the negotiations. And then there is also the aspect of the Russian crude purchases, which they've been profiteering on. So there are many levels going on here. I do think India is the world's largest democracy. The U.S. is the world's largest economy. I think at the end of the day, we will come together. I think a lot of it by the Indians has been performative. But I will tell you, Maria, I've said this all along during the tariff negotiations. The U.S. is the deficit country. When there is a schism in trade relations, the deficit country is at an advantage. It's the surplus country that should worry. So the Indians are selling to us. They have very high tariffs, and we have a very large deficit with them.
Do you worry that India is going to set trade in the rupee and they'll do trade with the rupee currency with the BRIC nations instead of the U.S. dollar?
There are a lot of things I worry about. The rupee becoming a reserve currency isn't one of them.
Right. No, I thought you would say that.
It's, on this trade problem with us, I think the rupee is near an all-time low versus the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, great point. Look, I spoke with the president of the European Central Bank over the weekend, Christine Lagarde, and I pushed her on this $300 billion in Russian assets that is sitting in Europe. What do you want to see here? Because I'd like to see others do what you and President Trump have been doing in terms of pressuring the world to stop doing business with Russia as a way to stop this war on Ukraine. What do you want to see for that $300 billion that is Russian assets sitting in European banks right now? I know it's frozen, and the EU has said that they'll use the interest on that money to rebuild Ukraine. But shouldn't all of that money go toward rebuilding Ukraine to ensure that Putin doesn't get his hands on that money anymore?
So, Maria, let's think about two things here, Maria. One, we could use a more fulsome the assist from our European partners here as President Trump is trying to end this war in Ukraine that never would have started if he'd been president. And our European allies need to step up. I don't see them threatening the tariffs on the Indians. And as a matter of fact, they're the ones buying the refined products that's made from the Russian oil.
Right.
So, the Europeans call the secondary tariffs. There's a bill going through the U.S. Senate. The Europeans call it the Graham bill because of sponsor Senator Lindsey Graham, and it gives the president authority, which he already has, but Senate-backed authority to put on high secondary tariffs. And at the G7 meeting, I asked our European allies, the G7 allies, if they were willing to join, and only Canada was willing to join. So the U.S. should not be expected to shoulder this alone.
Right.
This war is in their backyard. They have a vested interest in ending it just like we do. And President Trump is the only one who has created forward motion on this. And the U.S. people should not be expected to shoulder all the burden. So, 400 and whatever million people in the European Union who want this to end should also be part of the solution.
Yeah.
Number two, on the frozen Russian assets, I think that's all part of the negotiation with President Putin. So I don't think we should seize them immediately.
I see.
And it is a chip on the table during this big negotiating process, and we will see whether part of that goes to the Ukraine rebuild.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about China. Let's take a short break, but I know one top Chinese trade official is headed to Washington this week, and I'd love to get your take on the formal negotiations underway. Stay with us. We are talking with the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and we'll be right back with more.